Hello everybody and welcome to another episode of What the Trans.
What the Trans? Yes, indeed, we are back with a slight change to what we said would happen, but we'll get into that. But before that, how are you, Alex?
I'm doing well. It's been a lovely Friday afternoon. I had a nice relaxed day at work and I had a really fun delivery that came to my door today.
Yeah.
So recently we've been having a set of speakers that only works every Tuesday afternoon. And we thought we needed a replacement set of speakers. So we got ourselves a new sound bar for our house. We spent way too much money on it and I've just been playing around with that all afternoon. And I may have gone over my lunch break at work just because I was wanting to listen to Jewel of the Fates, which is my go-to bit of music for testing it out.
For testing speakers. Yeah, absolutely. My go-to bit of music for testing out a pair of speakers or a soundbar is Metallica did a few gigs with an orchestra. But there's an album called S&M. You see what they did there? And so the version of One that's Metallica live with a fucking orchestra, that's my way of testing. Oh my god,
I haven't heard that.
Oh, you should check it out.
I really want to now.
Would recommend. Well, do it after we've finished recording. But
it's a little bit of What the Trans just jamming to Metallica all for the hour and not actually talking about the news.
I think that's a What the Trans nights right there. Let's talk about our favourite albums. But yeah, it's a double album, which I had / maybe still have on CD because that's how old I am.
You're not that old. I've got CDs.
Oh, okay, all right. I was just checking.
I've done my burning of discs at times.
Nice.
Oh yeah, it's not. I haven't gone to the tape decks yet with whatever the mixtape is for that.
I used to make mixtapes. Me and my friends when we were first getting into like rock and metal and like the electronic music that can go hand in hand with it, like industrial sounds and remixes of Rob Zombie songs that were on the Matrix soundtrack and other stuff. And we would make tapes for each other, not in a romantic way, just in we all had a tape deck Walkman, which was the style at the time. And we'd just make tapes for each other, and it was pretty cool. Because by the time I started doing that romantically, we had moved on to CDs, so I would burn a CD for an intended or a loved one.
Very romantic.
Aside from receiving a new soundbar, what's been happening in the last couple of weeks for you?
Aside from a good soundbar, it's sort of been a fairly busy week. I had an exam that I was doing for my work. It was like this thing called ITIL, where it's sort of some theory crap, but I did a course about a year ago, so I hadn't done any revision prior to that, and I had about half an hour to go, till the exam started. It's like, I'll have a skim through of some of the material, and you can probably guess how that went.
Yeah.
I passed.
You passed, yeah.
80%. I was like, what?
Wow. Not bad for a quick look at some of the material.
Oh, exactly. I'm still quite struck at that one. But it seems I'm better at doing research on that front than most of the things we're going to be talking about today.
Well, I was going to say, doing journalistical research is its own discipline, really. But you can apply the skills learned from one place in another.
So yeah, that's been my week. How about yours? You've been very busy.
Yes, I have. I moved house. Honestly, it's kind of not as stressful as it used to be because I don't have to do any of the heavy lifting, which was, in a sense, it was quite nice, but also I did feel a bit useless, and that is, that's a whole can of worms for wheelchair users. I think there can be a certain point when everybody's doing lots of heavy lifting and moving stuff around and assembling furniture, which is what's happening in the next room from where I'm recording this. So we moved successfully. The old place, you've seen the old place, of course.
Oh yes, that was a lovely weekend out.
Yeah, it was a lovely apartment on the surface, but then there were so many things wrong with it, like the electrics were a bit screwed and the lights would just chew through light bulbs. The floor was incredibly uneven and damp had affected the floor in the kitchen to the extent that I couldn't park myself somewhere without putting my brakes on because I would just slowly roll towards the sort of dipped part in the kitchen.
Blimey.
We had constant issues with the water pressure, and obviously it was a duplex, and I am not able to use a duplex, really. I can't go up the stairs up to the second floor, so there was a lot of space that we weren't really using. So rather than paying the increased amount that the landlord wanted for it, which was pretty ridiculous in itself, really, we thought, fuck this, let's downsize. So we're now moving somewhere that's, notably smaller, but also quite a lot cheaper.
Sounds quite lovely, and I'm definitely going to be looking forward to making my visit this August.
Yes, and that'll be fun. Hopefully it won't be quite so fraught as the last visit was, because there was a lot of stuff going on that weekend, wasn't there? Wasn't a relaxing time.
I know, exactly. I'm definitely going to be looking forward to some pizza that day, because I think we had plans to make some pizza that day, but then we didn't quite get round to it, unfortunately.
Yes, for a number of reasons. Yes, indeed. Oh, pizza sounds great. God, if only we were ordering pizza tonight. Oh, wait, that's exactly what we are doing. Yeah.
Oh, damn.
All right, but before I can eat pizza, we have to record a podcast. So...
Yes, so speaking of moving houses, we're not only just moving a house, we're also moving some of our meat around, if that's a good way of putting it, that is, because...
I'll get back to you. I'll let you know.
As you may have known, it might have been a complete surprise to you right now, who knows, the cast review came out a few weeks ago, and... We've read through it, and we've got a whole bunch of academics who are chatting with Cal Horton,
Natasha Kennedy,
Rubes Walsh. I think at one point during a call I had with Ashleigh, I was like, God, we've literally got the Avengers of trans academics on the show.
Some people who are way cleverer than we are.
Yeah, but like the Avengers, the most difficult part of making those films is actually the scheduling.
Yes.
To make sure we get the most experts we can stuffed into one episode, we're going to have to delay the cast review deep dive until episode 105, unfortunately. But it's going to be worth the wait.
It is. Normally we finish one episode and then we give it a couple of days and then we immediately start writing the next episode, which is what we've done for years, literally. But this one is one of the first times that we've started working on it already. We've already had one of the conversations with one of the academics that we've been talking to. So that interview has already taken place. The interviews aren't going to be there here's an interview with Natasha Kennedy, here's an interview with Cal Horton. We're going to go through it point by point, and as we're doing that, we'll drop into and out of each of the interviews. So we will... be on point 3 and we'll be like, oh, here's what Cal Horton had to say about it, and here's what somebody else had to say about it, and then we move on to point 4. So it's going to all be a bit cut up. It's going to be the most intricately planned episode of What the Trans we've ever done, and we hope it will be worth the wait, and it will be something that we'll be able to point at and say, we did the research, here's what all of these points mean, here is what some very, very clever people think about that, and we hope it will be a really good one. So thank you for your patience, and let's get on with the rest of the episode, shall we?
Oh, indeed, and we've got to get, and I suppose for the rest of the episode, we've got to go to the news, haven't we?
Unfortunately, we do. That's our whole thing, sadly.
Not the news.
Mm-hmm.
It's been a while since we've said that. I suppose the first big story that came out, back in March, NHS England stated that they would pause new prescriptions of puberty blockers, and now, since the cast review was published, both Wales and Scotland have followed suit. The Sandyford Clinic in Glasgow, run by the NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde, announced the prescribing pause on April 18th, while NHS Wales announced their decision on April 23rd. From the Scottish Clinic, Dr Amelia Crichton said the findings informing the cast review are important, and we have reviewed the impact of our clinical pathways. The next step from here is to work with the Scottish Government and academic partners to generate evidence that enables us to deliver safe care for our patients. So again, the "we need more evidence" drum is being beaten. The statement from the Sandyford Clinic also talks a big game about patient safety, apparently without a trace of irony, and conveniently forgetting that forcing trans young people to go through the wrong puberty is to deliberately endanger them, potentially for decades. It's so weird how the trans stereotype that transphobes come out with are usually a result of a wrong puberty, and yet here they are forcing more people to go through it.
Yeah, funny that, isn't it? There's this kind of gleeful cruelty about it, isn't it? They know perfectly well that going through the wrong puberty makes things difficult and potentially dangerous for us, so that's why they're so keen for that to continue happening, I feel.
Oh, exactly, and if you force through the wrong puberty, you've got to go through more invasive medical procedures to undo the damage of puberty in the first place, and would be more of a horrid situation to go through. I mean, when I was reading through the cast review, it didn't even go to that sort of extreme itself. It didn't say there should be a blanket ban.
Yeah, it kind of implied it, but no, it didn't specifically say we need to stop this from happening in all cases.
Yeah, I mean, even in a absurdly narrow way they said it in the cast review. It said just in extreme cases, so I was like, don't do it entirely, but even then it's still saying you can still give people puberty blockers, and they've just said no to all of it. No. Even the most extreme cases.
But although it's worth pointing out, the people who are already receiving puberty blockers, they will continue to receive them. It's any new prescriptions of it that's been paused/banned. So anybody who's about to age into the service, who's been really looking forward to getting puberty blockers so they won't go through the wrong puberty, will now go through the wrong puberty.
Yes, there's no chance of getting it back until the regional services come in, where people will, from what seems to be from the CAS report, be forced to go through a research protocol to do it, which just is completely unethical, as we've seen from every single expert we've spoken to, and it's just horrid, honestly.
And I suspect more of this to come, really. There's going to be points in the future where someone is going to do something that negatively affects trans healthcare and uses the CAS review as an excuse to do it.
It's already being done in a few cases from what I've seen as well. To be fair, a lot of this was happening with the interim report, wasn't it, as well? Or
you're not wrong. So NHS England said that they would pause new prescriptions just after the interim report. But when the main report came out, as we talked about last episode, when the main report came out, that's when the Scottish and Welsh gender services have done the same.
Okay, so it's happened before. History has a annoying habit of repeating itself.
Well, it's not. That's the thing. It's not even history. It's
current
it's
affairs.
The present.
Yeah,
it's very definitely current affairs. Up next, in that vanishingly small category of actually pretty good news, we have this story from Sweden, where the age at which young people will legally be able to change their gender has been lowered from 18 to 16. The law sailed through Sweden's parliament and was passed with 234 votes in favour and only 94 against. Sweden was actually the first country in the world to create a law for the change of legal gender back in 1972. Now, there are still hoops to jump through, though. The current law states that a person has to have a diagnosis of gender dysphoria in order to make the change, and under the new law, which comes into force in July of 2025, a consultation with one doctor or psychologist and approval from the National Board of Health and Welfare will be enough. So you still do need to get some approval from cis people before you can do it, but lowering of the age at which you're able to do that is definitely a step in the right direction.
Yes.
Yeah, I thought that was pretty good news.
Yeah, I mean, anything to make life easier is just always to be welcomed. You only need a doctor. It separates the need for having some kind of It separates the need for having some kind of surgery to have the gender change on the certificate. So yeah, that's just fantastic. We need more of this.
Yeah, that's the kind of thing that we want to try and do in the UK, and that's essentially what the Scottish bill attempted to do. Remember, that was blocked by Westminster with Article 35. For the first time in history, the UK government blocks the Scottish government from
passing a law,
making its own laws. Yeah, exactly. And the thing that caused them to do that is we can't let trans people have any rights.
It's just literally the Tories having a tantrum.
So often the case, isn't it?
Oh, it really is. I mean, and I also noted when I was reading the article about this that the far-right opposition that opposed the bill, basically used the same line of a CAS review, just saying, we need more research into gender dysphoria. For me, it just gives me the impression of the CAS report having more wider-reaching implications in other countries as well as the UK as well. But it's good to see that no one listened to them and they just went with it anyway. So even if CAS has said something, it doesn't mean it'll affect Sweden in this case. So absolutely brilliant. What's not so brilliant is, despite promising that they'd improve waiting times in the gender service more broadly, the Scottish Government confirmed on April the 19th that the pot of money they'd set aside to be delivered into the gender services over 3 years would actually be delivered over 5 years, in essence reducing the funding the service would receive. The money, some £9 million, was to be provided as part of what's called the Butte House Agreement that the SNP has with the Scottish Greens has been delayed, and to be honest, no one is really talking about why. The Scottish Government told the Scotsman that the £9 million will be delivered over 5 years instead of 3 years. The aims of their strategy apparently include to bring gender identity services within national waiting time standards, which just makes me think of Chidi in The Good Place. Okay, but that's worse. You see how that's worse, right? When pressed further by the Scotsman, all the Scottish Government said was, we are investing £9 million to support the improvement of the NHS gender identity healthcare in Scotland. That funding is being delivered over a 5-year period, so that national improvement work already underway will be embedded and built upon. This aligns with feedback from health boards and third sector stakeholders regarding the need to support the sustainability of service improvement, which to me just sounds like a kind of press release word salad.
Yeah, that release doesn't really say anything, does it? It's like, here's what the money will be used for. And it's like, well, yeah, we know that. That's what the Butte House Agreement is all about. So you're just restating it without saying anything as to why they've decided that they'll, rather than provide that money over 3 years, they're providing it over 5. You know, like 9 million over the course of 3 years, 3 million per year, whereas they've been receiving less than that and will continue to.
Oh, definitely. And it's literally set fire to the Butte House Agreement. As of time of recording, it seems the Scottish Government has backed out of the Butte House Agreement with the collapse on Thursday of the SNP's power sharing agreement with the Greens.
Oh, dear.
So their power sharing agreement with the Greens has collapsed.
Well, we'll have to see what transpires in the future with that, given that the power sharing agreement with the Greens has actually recently collapsed since we wrote this story up. I don't think the gender services are necessarily going to be a priority for Hamza Youssef and the SNP just at the moment.
At the moment, it seems he's just fighting for his job. Like, with a no confidence vote next week, we're just going to have to see how that goes. Hamza Youssef hasn't been the only person pulling out of agreements.
You're very right, Alex, because you may remember from our last episode a story about the UK Council for Psychotherapy withdrawing its signature from a key document opposing conversion therapy, the Memorandum of Understanding of Conversion Therapy in the UK. In that story, we discussed the UKCP as one of a few different professional bodies for psychotherapists in the UK, and now we're going to talk about another one, the National Counselling and Psychotherapy Society, or NCPS. Now, another group called Therapists Against Conversion Therapy and Transphobia, or TACTT, wrote to the NCPS to clarify their position on conversion therapy after the NCPS was referred to in the withdrawal statement that the UKCP wrote. However, after sending that letter, TACTT then took a good look at that Memorandum of Understanding and found that the NCPS's signature is also not on it. Now, this could be a simple mistake. NCPS did change its name from NCS to NCPS, which might have thrown a spanner in the works somehow, but equally it might not be, implying that they very quietly removed their signature from the MOU at some point in the past. TACTT are expecting a response to their initial letter within the next month, so hopefully there will be a good reason for it. So, yes, what did you make of this?
So the acronym withdraw from the other acronym, and another acronym isn't so happy about it.
Pretty much, yeah.
It's quite a crap decision by the NCPS. I mean, they didn't consult any of their members, which, if you're a member-led organisation, you'd tend to need to do that?
At the moment, we don't know if the NCPS has officially kind of pulled out of it, because it's so TACT, TACTT, TACT, have written to them clarifying, saying, well, look, are we still signatories to this or not? Since writing that letter and sending it, they've discovered that in the public list of groups that have signed the MOU, that they're not on it, and they kind of should be. You know, that's what the members of the NCPS had expected. But if they have taken their signature off it at some point in the past, that kind of would explain why they were so quiet after the UKCP removed their signature off it a couple of weeks ago. The NCPS didn't make a statement, despite their members actually saying, why are you not making a statement around this? You know, you're another professional body, you should be holding them to account. You should be asking why, but nothing is being said. There could be any one of a number of reasons for that, but on the face of it, this doesn't look great.
No, it does. I mean, we don't know what the motivation is behind it, purposeful or not purposeful. If you have to physically unsign it as an organisation, it's sort of one where you can't really comment on the motives of something until you've sort of know what the situation is on that front, really.
The uncertainty of it, I think, is probably riling up quite a few of the members of the NCPS, because it could be that some of them are members of NCPS and they're also part of TACT as well, in which case they too are not represented as the members of the UKCP, who are also against conversion therapy, which all therapists should be, given that conversion therapy isn't really a therapy.
Really?
Yeah, shocking stuff, right?
Another shocking news, we've got another positive story. On the 24th of April, it was reported by Ryan Castellucci that they have been granted permission to appeal a judgment of the High Court that a decision not to issue them a non-binary gender recognition certificate was lawful. Having brought a judicial review to the High Court back in January 2024, the High Court ruled that contextual and linguistic factors pointed to Parliament intending that the word gender means binary gender throughout, and that this discrimination could be justified on grounds of administrative convenience and cost, and that any change were a matter for Parliament. However, following this, it has now been challenged and is due to be heard in the Court of Appeals. The permission was granted due to the case raising novel arguments. Following this, Ryan said, "I am grateful to the court for recognising the importance of my case by granting me permissions to appeal. All I want is for a gender recognition certificate affirming my acquired gender to be issued as the Gender Recognition Act plainly requires. This would cost no more than any other GRC, pointing that the government's computers already support listing a person's gender as not specified, as long as not specified is established to mean neither female nor male. I would be happy with that option. We shall see how that goes."
I hope that this goes well for Castellucci, who it should be pointed out is a US citizen currently residing in the UK. Am I getting that right?
I think that's it, yeah. Because there's a bit of a issue with the list of recognised countries where gender recognition certificates are listed there as well, wasn't there?
Yes, Kemi Badenoch's regime has kind of issued a list of countries where if they've got a slightly lax system of gender recognition than the UK does, then the UK will kind of refuse to recognise that change of gender. You know, it's the UK government deciding, oh, no, that doesn't count.
Yeah, pretty much. And in California, by the looks of it, they had an option for non-binary as well. And under that specific section, they were applying for a non-binary one. But then the UK administrative system didn't take to it too kindly.
But yeah, I look forward to see how this court session goes, because if it goes well, and I really do hope it does, that could be something quite seismic, obviously for non-binary people in the UK.
Oh, exactly. And it would give some kind of precedent to say the UK can give out some kind of non-binary gender recognition certificate in a way, and lead some kind of pathway to that, really.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
So we'll make sure to link the crowdfunder in the description of the pod for that one.
Yep, because legal action ain't cheap.
On the same day as this, by the looks of it was found by Trans Safety Network, Trans Activism UK, and other trans rights organisations that the EHRC had sent a letter to all of them, complaining about Ganry not taking kindly to the EHRC failing to uphold its responsibilities to protect human rights. Whilst the contents of the letter weren't revealed, we managed to get a copy, and we can now read the contents out of that letter.
Dear Redacted, I hope this letter finds you well. I want to highlight our recent and planned work in relation to sexual orientation and gender reassignment, and in particular areas where we consider there are opportunities to engage positively and collaborate on matters within the remit of the Equality and Human Rights Commission. As you will be aware, the UN Subcommittee on Accreditation is due to undertake a review of the EHRC's accreditation status, following representations made by stakeholders. We are disappointed that we will have to defend our accreditation status in this way, and we strongly reject claims that we are not compliant with the Paris Principles. However, I seek to emphasise our determination, irrespective of the outcome, to continue defending the interests of groups across all 9 protected characteristics, including those with the protective characteristics of sexual orientation and gender reassignment. It is our fundamental duty to protect and promote rights for all, as per the UK's equality and human rights laws, and we take this with the utmost seriousness. Ha.
I've got to put a posh accent on this one now. You will no doubt be aware that several of the concerns we have articulated over the past few years with regard to government consultations and proposed legislation have been informed by the benefit of our expert analysis of the law and careful consideration of human rights and equality considerations of children and young people, adult LGBT people and sex-based rights. Many of our positions have recently been upheld, either through litigation or in the recent final report of Dr. Hilary Cass and her independent review. We intend to carefully consider her findings and urge all those who are working with and providing services for children and young people to urgently focus themselves on the task of implementing Dr. Cass's recommendations in full. That's probably the worst posh accent I've done for a while. They must work cooperatively and professionally to deliver the quality services that our children and young people deserve. I would also like to highlight that we have recently responded to the Department of Education's recent consultation on their draft guidance for English schools regarding gender questioning children. In this, we have highlighted the importance of making clear that children can have the protected characteristic of gender reassignment, and the schools should be aware of the need to prevent discrimination against them on the basis of that characteristic. Over the past 3 years, we have engaged repeatedly with the ministers in the Department for Health and Social Care to highlight the ongoing issues with the unacceptably long waiting times to access gender identity services, particularly of England. These were highlighted in our flagship 2023 report. The Equality and Human Rights Monitor, NHS England, rolled out several pilot schemes to help address this issue, and we have been pleased to see that 2 of these schemes have been awarded contracts to provide gender identity services in the longer term. However, we continue to hear concerns about waiting times and the provision of interim support, including mental health services for those on waiting lists. We will continue to highlight the importance of reducing these waiting times.
On the long-awaited ban on conversion practices for sexual orientation and gender identity, we wrote to the Minister for Women and Equalities in October 2023 to once again call for this draft legislation to be published. It is imperative that a ban is drafted in a way that protects LGBT people from cruel, unnecessary and harmful activity conversion practice, while ensuring that it does not restrict legitimate and appropriate counselling, therapy or support. We would welcome the opportunity to speak with you about these matters in the coming months. In February, we also published our baseline evaluation of the UK's implementation of the Istanbul Convention, the International Convention to Prevent Violence Against Women and Girls. This included important information we heard from stakeholders about intersectional issues affecting particularly LGBT women and girls, including hate crime and the barriers caused by fear of discrimination in accessing support services or justice.
Takes a lot of breath out of you, that one. Later this year, we plan to consult on our next strategic plan. This plan will determine our high-level priorities and areas of focus for 2025 to 2028. I would very much welcome your thoughts and views on these proposals and would be happy to share the consultation when it is live. There will be an opportunity to provide feedback on our updated statutory services Code of Practice, which is intended to set out the technical details of the Equality Act and to give individuals, businesses, employers and public authorities the information they need to meet their responsibilities. This will also be consulted on later in the year. More generally, we would be keen to hear about the policy priorities of your organisation in the context of an upcoming UK general election, and what you would hope to see any new government take forward to improve the lives of the people that you represent. We will be considering how we can best work with the governments across Britain to protect and promote the rights of people who share protected characteristics, and we would welcome your views and feedback on areas of priority for LGBT people and where we may be able to work with you to achieve impact.
While we await the outcome of our accreditation review in May, we will continue to take our compliance with the Paris Principles, our ability to conduct our mandate independently, our duty to take positions in line with international standards, and our cooperation with civil society with the utmost seriousness. We remain focused on the job we are here to do, to advance the equality of opportunity and protect the human rights of everyone in Britain. We are wholeheartedly committed to fulfilling our statutory mandate and welcome any feedback on how best we can do so by working with you on the rights of LGBT people. Yours sincerely, Kishwa Faulkner.
Kiss.
Yeah, kiss, mega lols. So that we recognise that letter is a lot.
The longest amount of time we've had to use our posh accents for.
Oh, speak for yourself. There's a lot of stuff in this letter we could talk about. I think there's a few points that you've highlighted already. Particularly that part, we would be keen to hear about the policy priorities of your organisation in the context of an upcoming election and what you would hope to see any new government take forward to improve the lives of the people you represent, which seems a bit optimistic, really. That seems like they're promising something they can't deliver and realistically won't be asked to deliver.
And even if they're in office with the next Labour government, if they don't sack them. But we don't know about that yet.
We shall see. Well, that's the thing. The person who's in charge at the EHRC is supposed to be, genuinely meant to be, independent. But now, because that's what the Tories have done, they've turned it into definitely a party apparatchik appointee type person. So now Labour will feel it incumbent upon them to do the same. And we'll just kind of go back and forth every 10 or 15 years.
Oh, exactly, like some kind of Supreme Court situation where, like, oh, look, one of the justices has passed away. Let's put someone who's more in our favour into the stead.
Quite. There's also that part about drafting a ban which protects LGBT people from harmful conversion practices while ensuring that it does not restrict legitimate and appropriate counselling, therapy or support. And that's quite vague, and I suspect quite deliberately so.
Yeah, when I spoke to some people who did receive the letter, there were concerns raised about whether that could still mean, oh yeah, we'll just still allow some forms of conversion therapy. Only the little ones, definitely not the big ones. Just leaving that loophole lying around, really. And did we have a statement from EHRC regarding the CAS report prior to this?
That's a good question. That's definitely something we should have looked up before we started recording. but I don't know. Is the
12th
honest
of
answer.
April. We welcome the publication. Yeah, they have endorsed it.
Okay.
So I was about to say, oh yeah, this letter said they endorsed it, but I didn't know if they had said it previously. But like, it almost feels like a bit of a gloat to say many of our positions have recently been upheld, either through litigation or in the final report of the CAS report. It just sounds like we were right. Then again, as we've got going to be pointing out a lot, or what we've already pointed out, don't rest your laurels on that one, Hillary. Or no, Kishwa.
Yeah, quite. Well, both of them really.
I always get my transphobes mixed up.
It's a bit tricky, isn't it? They've all got the same hair. The thing is, they've said our positions have recently been upheld either through litigation, but a lot of them haven't, though, is the thing. A lot of the positions espoused by Kishwa Faulkner and others in the EHRC have quite specifically been found not to be so good in litigation. I mean, yeah, fine, a couple of them did, but the rest of them didn't, and there have been a good few. So to say that many of our positions have recently been is, again, that's kind of stretching it to a degree which is extremely questionable, as is so often the case with our friends in blue.
It doesn't really provide the most goodwill if you're saying, oh look, we proved you wrong, as you can see from legal cases, that when you're trying to, in this case, their situation, proactively reach out to engage, spiting them in the same letter doesn't really convey that very well. I suppose you get the intention of we need to engage more with them, but then there seems to be a undertone of not really wanting to either.
Yeah. It's difficult. I was scratching my head when the news of this came out, right? That they'd specifically written to places like Trans Safety Network, for example, because that's an organisation that is so far from what the Tory government is trying to do to and provide for trans people. It kind of seems like a really late... You know when you're at school and someone's like been bullying you and then right before they get told off they say, oh Jesus, I'm sorry. It's like that.
Yeah, I was trying to find that metaphor right there. I was like, it's like if the kid's been told off by their parents and been ushered off to say, go play nice now and don't be a dick. It's that kind of vibe.
It is, yeah, where they've just kind of realised, oh shit, we need to do some damage control before we get thoroughly landslided out of office. Or, God, I really hope that's what happens. I can't stand another 5 years of these monsters.
Oh, those twats, yeah. I mean, it sort of gives the impression, and also with that, if you want to proactively work with an org out of the blue, like LGBT rights organisations, would have been better to leave the bit about Ganry unsaid.
Yes. Yeah, like definitely saying the quiet part out loud there, because they're just, by mentioning that, they're drawing attention to it. Although, perhaps, if they'd left it unsaid, that would have been notable by its absence, perhaps.
I suppose it would be, but then... it's sort of like if I went, I didn't want to talk to you, but I'll have to talk to you anyway. Or just like you only being able to tell via the tone of a voice saying, yeah, I'd love to work with you. That sort of tone of the voice. But I don't know how I'd react if I was one of the orgs being sent these letters.
I mean...
we hadn't received one.
We hadn't received one. Why on earth would they have sent us one?
No, yeah.
We don't even have an official address. Let's move on, shall we? Because we could spend forever just scratching our heads over this and saying, why on earth would you? But we'll never find the answer.
Because I was going to say, would you leave them to hang out to dry?
Oh yes, very definitely. Make it perfectly clear. Here's what they've said, and here's our response to them. Go fuck yourselves.
Oh, hell yeah. I mean, I think I saw in a tweet by Claire Trans Talks, she exclusively said, we're not engaging with you because this is clearly trying to cover your asses. And
yes,
Fuck It Up Faulkner has fucked around and now she has found out.
Yep.
But yeah, I suppose we've got to move on from that, because I could rant about the HRC all day.
Yes, we both could. Okay, so this time for, the next bit of the show, the meat, we have something a little different. So in preparation for our deep dive into the CAS review, as we've mentioned, we realised it was a much larger piece of work than we could realistically do in a couple of weeks. So that's going to be episode 105 and potentially 106 as well. We'll be going through it section by section and speaking to several different academics as we do so. Those conversations have already begun, as has the writing. So for the rest of this episode, we're going to be handing the mic over to one of those academics, Dr Cal Horton. They've written an excellent breakdown of the attitudes behind the review, a transcript of which we will make available through our social media. So take it away, Dr Horton.
Hello, my name is Dr Cal Horton. I'm a research fellow focused on the experiences, rights and well-being of trans children. I've been deeply immersed in the literature on this topic for many years and followed the CAS review initially with hope and more recently with a great deal of concern. The CAS review was established by the UK government and NHS England, supposedly to uncover best practices in healthcare for trans and gender diverse children and young people. There were concerns from the start, with the review choosing to appoint to its leadership a doctor selected for having no knowledge of trans communities, trans children or trans healthcare, and with the review explicitly excluding trans people, including trans clinicians or trans healthcare researchers, from the review's governance body, whilst inviting a number of alleged conversion therapists to be part of their core team. The CAS final report made a number of extremely dangerous recommendations, amongst them restrictions on access to puberty blockers with no current route to any adolescents accessing them on the NHS. It also cautioned against social transition, particularly in childhood, recommended that clinicians and psychologists be involved before any support or affirmation for a trans child. These recommendations have raised significant concerns and fears amongst those of us who understand the existing literature on trans children, and for those of us who have personal experience of being trans or supporting a trans child. Since the publication of the CAS final report, I have been approached by concerned trans young people, by concerned parents and by erstwhile allies, asking the same three questions that I want to speak on today. People have been asking me, does the evidence show that social transition has more harms than benefits for trans children? Does the evidence show that puberty blockers have more harms than benefits for trans children? Does the evidence justify current restrictions on both social transition and puberty blockers? For those of you who only want to listen for 1 minute more, I will summarise. The evidence shows clear benefits of puberty blockers and no significant harms. They are recognised as safe and effective in blocking puberty, and are still today recommended with no controversy when used by cis children. The evidence shows clear benefits of social transition and zero recorded harms. The evidence in no way justifies the current restrictions on either social transition or puberty blockers. For those of you who are interested in listening for a while longer, I will in the next 20 minutes or so delve into the evidence base and the CAS review approach to evidence, revealing the manipulations or sleights of hand used to justify current policy restrictions. I will start with the topic of social transition. The CAS review's approach to social transition can be regarded as a perfect example of a healthcare service being impacted by anti-trans bias. Instead of the evidence-based policy-making it claims to deliver, it is an exemplar of prejudice-driven evidence. I will here cover this topic across 5 sections. Section 1. Appraising modern evidence. Firstly, we can consider the CAS review's approach to disregarding existing evidence on social transition. The CAS review relies upon a systematic review of literature on social transition conducted by the University of York in partnership with Tilly Langton. Tilly Langton is a controversial former clinician at GIDS, the English Children's Gender Clinic that has recently been closed down. The Trans Safety Network has raised concerns about Tilly Langton's connections with gender exploratory therapy, an approach that the Trans Safety Network consider to be conversion therapy. Having such an individual at the heart of the research team leading the systematic reviews has raised significant concerns. The systematic review conducted by York took a portion of current literature on social transition. Qualitative literature, so literature that actually talked to and listened to trans children or families, was disregarded. My own peer-reviewed articles on the experiences with social transition of trans children and families in the UK was not even acknowledged, which may strike you as strange in a review that continually bemoans insufficient evidence. The systematic review summarises its selected portion of existing literature on social transition in a way that decenters and erases critical research findings. Reading the York Systematic Review provides limited insight into what the existing literature actually says about social transition. By contrast, I reviewed all existing literature on social transition in a peer-reviewed scoping study published at the start of this year in the leading journal for trans healthcare, which is worth a read if you want to see what the current literature actually says about social transition. Let's take one study as an example to see what York has done in its systematic literature review. Let's look at a 2016 study by Christina Olson from the USA. This study followed 73 socially transitioned trans children from the US and Canada. The research was considered groundbreaking at the time of publication, back in 2016. It found that trans children who were supported and able to socially transition in childhood had positive levels of mental health, depression and anxiety, levels of mental health similar to their cis peers. This was in direct contrast to research at the same time from populations of trans children and adolescents who had not been supported to socially transition, where high levels of depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation or suicide attempts were common. This groundbreaking finding that supported trans children have good levels of mental health is reported by the York Systematic Review thus. The study found no significant difference in depressive symptoms compared with population averages. Do you see how the study's own findings have been distorted to make it sound as though the study result is inconclusive? The York Systematic Review fails to analyse and summarise the substance of the findings and conclusions of the existing literature. By contrast, my own peer-reviewed scoping study on social transition synthesises all the recorded benefits and harms within the current literature. Positive outcomes are noted across a broad range of domains. Social transition is associated with positive mental health, reduced depression and anxiety, reduced suicidal ideation, increased happiness, improved school attendance, improved educational attainment. These potential benefits are noted across a range of study types. These benefits are especially emphasised in any studies that actually spoke to trans children or their families about their experiences. However, all studies that actually spoke to trans children and families are disregarded by the CAS review as being low quality. The systematic review claims to undertake an assessment of study rigour, representativeness or quality, utilising this assessment to devalue the studies that listen to trans children or families. Bizarrely, they adopt a definition of social transition that is no way considered standard, including children who've only changed appearance or clothing in order to justify inclusion of a 2013 study in which no youth actually socially transitioned according to today's understanding of this term. Their quality assessment criteria, which are not well explained and were completely invented by the York team, enable them to assess studies such as the 2016 Olson study as low quality, scoring 1.5 out of 5. The Olson study is downrated because the children in the sample were not representative of all trans children, because their families were willing to support a trans child, while many are not. It was downrated because it did not include a control group of the same trans children who were denied social transition throughout childhood just to improve study rigour. This study took data from a community sample, and within a community sample is obviously not within the researcher's control to create a control group of the same children who were forcibly denied affirmation for years at a time. There are huge ethical problems in suggesting it should be possible to create a control group of trans children who equally wanted to socially transition but are denied it for years on end. The fact that some clinical centres have ambitions for such a study raises serious concerns about clinical control and abuse of trans children in the name of research. There's another quality factor, reliability of ascertainment of social transition. It is not defined or explained. The Olson study does not pass this criteria, whatever it means. The Steensma study from 2013, the one that the York team had to redefine social transition in order to include, that only focused on children who had changed their clothes or hair, is rated as the second highest quality. There is significant massaging of the criteria for quality in order to devalue the evidence base that most strongly supports the benefits of social transition. The York approach to quality assessment does not require studies to have actually spoken to the subjects of their research. In a field where there is a small population and a limited body of current literature, we have to question what is the most appropriate approach to reviewing the literature. Should we review all the literature to see what benefits and harms can be found and take the best possible decisions based on existing evidence, whilst highlighting future research priorities? Or should we critique the quality of existing literature, rule it of insufficient quality, rule it therefore inconsequential, and then proceed to policy making with no consideration of the existing evidence base? This is the York and Cass approach. Social transition in trans children is a step initiated by a trans child, usually in the face of substantial opposition and delays by all those around that child. When a trans child asks to be seen as who they are, asks to be shown acceptance and love and support, a trans-positive parent would respond with love and acceptance, unless there is a clear reason to do otherwise. The Cass review surely has some significant evidence of potential harms of a social transition in order to justify caution or restrictions. Surely there is some evidence of harm to counter the existing evidence base of benefits. Across all existing studies, the results are either extremely positive on the benefits of social transition, 15 studies report significant benefits, or are neutral on the topic. 2 clinical studies reported neither positive nor negative impacts. These studies have methodological limitations linked to not speaking to the subjects of their research. Within all of the existing literature, there are no examples of harm caused by social transition. 0. Let me repeat that. There are 0 examples of harms of social transition in the current literature. How, you might ask, does the Cass review move from an existing body of literature that is predominantly extremely positive on social transition, with 2 studies that are neutral, and no evidence at all of harm across any of the literature, to a policy position cautioning or restricting social transition? There are 3 steps in this sleight of hand. Step 1, as explained earlier, critique the existing literature as low quality, using the systematic review to claim that we know nothing on this subject with any certainty. Step 2, create a completely unevidenced potential harm to counter the known benefits of social transition. Step 3, argue that this fabricated harm in Step 2 justifies restrictions on social transition until the time when the evidence of benefits is rigorous, high quality, and certain. In Step 2, the Cass Review and the associated York Systematic Review article makes a claim that social transition may change the outcome or trajectory for trans children. The word may is doing extremely heavy lifting here. They speculate that perhaps we should be concerned when socially transitioned trans children grow into trans adolescents and trans adults. Perhaps, say those opposed to trans existence, it is the social transition, rather than them being trans, that makes them continue as trans. The Cass Review speculates that perhaps these children become stuck as trans, cemented into a trans existence. What horror! The Cass approach disregards the claim that social transition is good for mental health and happiness as insufficiently evidenced. Cass doesn't even consider the idea that trans kids have a right to self-actualization. At the end of last week, Cass released some follow-up clarifications, trying to disrupt trans community criticisms that the Cass report is biased and intentionally devised to deny trans rights and trans healthcare. In this clarification, Cass repeats the assertion that the literature on social transition is inconclusive. The existing evidence that shows a host of benefits and 0 harms is not rigorous enough, according to Cass, to merit any conclusions whatsoever. In the very next sentence, Dr. Cass states, with utter authority and confidence, that the majority of trans kids will stop being trans at puberty, especially if denied social transition. The Cass report presents the theory that social transition may change a trajectory and cement trans kids into a trans existence. This claim is upheld with literally 0 evidence. 0. A trans-positive policy position that social transition is beneficial is rejected outright, described as unevidenced. A very much weaker claim, used to justify restrictions, is presented authoritatively as though settled fact. This kind of a double standard is a feature across the CAS review. It is prejudice-driven evidence, prejudice-driven policy. Let's look at the evidence for the claim that social transition may change trajectory. In attempting to justify this claim, the CAS review looks to some really old studies and makes some really wildly inappropriate leaps of faith, which we'll investigate in Section 2. Section 2, a shift in trajectory. The key evidence cited to justify the theory that trans children are having their trajectory changed by social transition is a 2016 literature review by Ristori and Steensma. This same 2016 literature review is also used to justify the same theory that puberty blockers are also changing the outcome and cementing trans children of today into trans identities into adolescence and adulthood. If only we went back to the approaches of last century, with widespread denial of social transition and puberty blockers, then we could stop trans children from growing up as transgender. The fact that this 2016 literature review takes such a prominent place in justifying the policy recommendations of the 2024 CAS review demonstrates just how far they need to stretch to justify their policy preferences. The 2016 literature review has itself been widely criticised since publication. It has long been the document that anti-trans advocates in the UK have relied upon to justify restrictions on trans children's lives and healthcare. I critiqued this very article in depth in 2017 in my blog Growing Up Transgender. I was not surprised to see the same 2016 literature review taking a central place in legitimising CAS policy recommendations in 2024. It provides a rather complex and hard-to-critique cover for anti-trans policy recommendations. It is also inaccessible, being a publication that is not open access and cannot be read by most. This literature review includes studies like the 1968 article Deviant Gender Role Behaviour in Children, Relation to Homosexuality, the 1984 article The Early Effeminate Behaviour in Boys, Outcome and Significance for Homosexuality, the 1985 article Extreme Boyhood Femininity, Isolated Behaviour or Pervasive Disorder, and the 1987 article, The Sissy Boy Syndrome and the Development of Homosexuality. This is the literature the 2024 CAS review is looking to. The 2016 literature review looks at gender clinic studies or studies on gender non-conforming children from the 1950s to the early 2000s. Across these studies, it reports a very low portion of gender clinic kids being trans in adolescence or adulthood. Apparently, in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and 2000s, gender clinics did something that ensured only a minority of kids ended up as trans, whereas now in 2024, the majority of kids in gender clinics are recorded as trans into adolescence and adulthood. For the CAS review, this so-called shift from a minority of gender clinic kids growing up as trans to now a majority is very significant and worrying. This is the silver bullet of supposed harm that the CAS review utilises to justify authoritarian restrictions or caution on social transition. What if, they claim, it is the social transition that has changed the outcome, or the puberty blocker, or both? What if we moved back to the approaches of the 1950s or 1980s, when apparently there were no trans teenagers or adults, where a majority were cured in early childhood? Could we save innocent children from a terrible future of being trans? This is literally the principal argument upon which the CAS review bases its opposition to both social transition and puberty blockers, and the 2016 Ristori and Steensma literature review is the key citation to substantiate this theory. Section 3. Puberty blockers. There are two important questions when reviewing evidence on puberty blockers. Question 1. Are they effective? The evidence is very clear that puberty blockers are effective at blocking puberty. This has never been in doubt. Despite incontrovertible evidence that they are effective at their primary purpose, stopping puberty, the CAS review puts doubts on the evidence by shifting the goalposts. Instead of asking, are they effective at stopping puberty, and therefore useful for youth who wish to stop puberty, the CAS review asks a different question. They ask, are puberty blockers effective in treating gender dysphoria? You will be shook, dear listeners, when I tell you that the CAS review manages to wrangle the literature review in order to claim that there is insufficient evidence that puberty blockers treat gender dysphoria. The second important question on puberty blockers is this: are they safe? This question, again, is incontrovertible if you guard yourself against anti-trans bias. Puberty blockers are categorically safe. The exact same medication is used in the NHS today with zero controversy or concern, as long as it is used for stopping the puberty of cis kids. Evidence of its safety when used to stop puberty is ignored by the CAS review by manipulating the goalposts. Safe use for cis kids is evidence as safe for treating precocious puberty, but not evidence for treating gender dysphoria. The exact same medication for the exact same reason, pausing puberty, is somehow less safe for treating trans kids. There are not any actual arguments for a claim that puberty blockers are unsafe. There are some known minor side effects, as with any medication, that can be monitored and managed. Blocking puberty delays the increase of bone density that comes with pubertal sex hormones that can be important for supporting growing bodies. This needs to be monitored, and youth shouldn't be without sex hormones for too many years. This is a standard part of individualised healthcare. In place of any actual evidence of harms of puberty blockers, alongside a body of low-quality evidence of benefits of puberty blockers, the CAS review bases its opposition to puberty blockers on the same claim, that puberty blockers, as with social transition, may change the trajectory and outcome, cementing kids into continued existence as trans when perhaps a lack of social transition or being forced through endogenous puberty against their will would be just what is needed to make them cis. Let's put aside some obvious conceptual and ethical flaws for 1 minute and focus on the evidence supporting the claim that there are now kids growing up as trans who might have ended up as cis if those around them had adopted a more restrictive approach. The only evidence for this claim that puberty blockers may change outcomes is the very same 2016 literature review that supposedly proves beyond a shadow of doubt that trans kids are being cemented into a trans identity by having social support or puberty blockers. We need to look at this 2016 literature review. Part 4. Older gender clinics. The 2016 literature review by Ristori and Steensma is cited to claim that a minority of trans kids in the 1950s to 2000s grew up to be trans adolescents and adults. To claim that something negative and worrying has happened to change the outcome. We need to look at this literature review and its associated literature and ask, has there indeed been a meaningful shift in trajectories? Are too many children staying as trans into adolescence? Are gender clinics no longer being successful in curing trans children? To answer these questions, we have to understand what the purpose of a gender clinic was last century. In the 1940s, being gay was criminalised and penalised across a majority of the world. Being gay was a problem. Countries and psychiatrists tried efforts to stop gayness. Literal torture and imprisonment, however, did not stop gay people from existing. The medical and psychiatric establishment recognised that they couldn't stop gay adults from existing, but could they stop gay adults from coming into existence? Is there something that they could do in the childhoods of these people who grow up to be gay to stop this? In the establishment thinking of the 1950s, being gay was obviously and categorically a bad thing. Gay people had difficult and lonely lives. It would be better for everyone if they just stopped being gay. Eradicating gayness was clearly a moral good. The primary focus of gender clinics at this time was almost exclusively on preventing men and boys from growing up to be gay. Gayness in women was perhaps less of a challenge to the social order, and in any case women were more easily, socially, legally and financially controlled at that time. Theorists of the 1950s and 60s didn't properly understand or care about the distinction between gay and trans. In fact, being trans was seen as a more extreme case of the same disorder. A gender identity disorder that went from being proto-gay or a bit gay through to very gay through to trans. It was hoped that if you intervened in childhood at the point of being proto-gay or a bit gay, you could stop the progression through to very gay or even worse to trans. Being a bit gay in childhood was not related to sexual or romantic attraction. Instead, a long list of factors that were a bit gay were highlighted as being risk factors for a dangerous journey towards actual gayness or transness. These risk factors in young boys included showing emotion, being bad at sports, sitting in an unmanly posture, being friends with girls, playing with girls' toys, not playing with guns, liking your mother. In misogynistic gender clinics from the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s and 2000s, a very big focus was placed on blaming mothers. Mothers were to blame for permitting their sons to show emotion, for not punishing them for gentleness, for showing their sons too much kindness. Gender clinics had projects in the 1980s literally titled the Sissy Boy Project. Boys who were considered proto-gay were punished and shamed for being insufficiently masculine. A man called Carl Bryant was one of the key children tortured and harmed in the Sissy Boy Research Project. In adulthood, he wrote a PhD on his experiences, work that has been one of the most significant influences on my own work. He was never a trans child, he was a cis boy who was deemed by gender clinicians to be unacceptably unmanly. He wrote about the harm and trauma of his experiences in gender clinics, of the shame of feeling that who he was at some deep level unacceptable to those he loved the most. Carl Bryant did not grow up to be a trans woman, but he was never studied and researched for being a trans child. Yet this exact study is one of those included in the 2016 Literature Review and relied upon by CAS to justify the claim that it is social transitional puberty blockers that is causing today's gender clinic children to be locked into a trans identity. Gender clinics of the 1950s to 1980s were not filled with trans children as they are today. They were filled with the kids, almost all boys, whose parents feared they might grow up gay. They were the kids deemed unacceptable for having emotions, for being friends with girls, for being gentle or being close with their mothers. A vast majority of these children, problematized for their non-conformity, did not grow up to be trans women, but they were also not trans children. They are a substantively different cohort. This will not be a revelation to the CAS team. They are aware of this criticism of the older literature, but this criticism is pushed to the side because this theory is the only justification they can find for the policy recommendations they wish to endorse. In the gender clinics of the 1950s and 60s, the treatment goal of such clinics was overtly to prevent homosexuality. In the 1970s and 80s, the decriminalization of homosexuality and increased movements for gay rights pushed gender clinics to be less overt in their aims. They no longer explicitly spoke of preventing homosexuality, but the same proto-gay risk factors of playing with girls' toys or being close to your mother were instead rebranded as gender identity disorder. Being trans was not part of the diagnosis used by gender clinics until after 2013. Before 2013, gender clinics diagnosed and problematized mainly boys for gender nonconformity. The fact that a large majority of the children being studied and probed for gender nonconformity in the 1950s to 80s ended up as cis adults is completely irrelevant to the question of how best to support trans children in 2024. Yet these same studies are relied upon for CAS's key objection to both social transition and puberty blockers. Within the 2016 Literature Review, there are a handful of studies that are slightly more modern. The handful of studies from the 1990s and early 2000s looked at a more mixed cohort, with more trans children being researched and probed in their treatment arms. Treatment involving hiding girly toys and telling mothers to stop hugging their children to make them toughen up. As more families grew in acceptance of the idea of a child growing up to be gay, the cohort of children whose families took them to have their behaviour analysed or fixed at a gender clinic grew to include more trans girls. Trans boys and gender non-conforming cis girls were more rare in gender clinics at that time, when the biggest concern was on problematic femininity. The later studies of the 1990s and early 2000s already show a significant shift in the portion of children who are classified as identifying as trans in adolescence or adulthood. This shift did not speak to a change in outcome, but a change in those being seen in the clinic, with a reduction in children being problematized for the worry that they could end up as gay. If you read these studies closely, the authors have some clear insights. Steensma, for example, writes that there is a significant difference amongst the cohort being seen in gender clinics at that time. He writes that there are a portion of children who are distressed at the idea of puberty and express a desire to socially transition, Social transition in childhood was not supported by clinics in that period. This portion, the portion who is distressed by puberty and wants to transition, you might presume, are trans. Another portion of the children in their clinic are not distressed at the idea of puberty and do not wish to transition. This portion, you might presume, are not trans. But how these children actually identify, we do not know. The study authors did not bother to ask the children under their care. The researchers' focus was not on identity, but on problematizing gender nonconformity and trying to work out which ones would end up gay or trans in adulthood. This very work, including this specific publication by Steensma, is used by Cass to justify a claim that the very process of going through puberty will resolve gender identity-related distress in the majority of cases, will make a trans child cis. Yet even that very study is very clear that there are two groups, one who is distressed at the idea of puberty and another who is not. Even this older research by Steensma absolutely does not show that forcing a trans child who is distressed about puberty through endogenous puberty will make that child cis. The 2016 literature review cited by Cass encompasses studies that aimed to eradicate homosexuality in the 1950s and 60s, studies aiming to eradicate unmanly behaviour in the 1980s, through to studies that problematized hobbies, mannerisms, and friendships in the 90s and 2000s. The majority of children in these studies were not trans. How many were trans we will never know. The study authors did not bother to ask those who they researched, and in any case, trans identity was not their primary focus. This is the foundation upon which the Cass review bases their hypothesis that social transition or puberty blockers changes the trajectory, keeping kids as trans who might otherwise be cis. This is the foundation upon which Cass makes the claim that a majority of children will desist at point of puberty so long as they are forced through an endogenous puberty. Part 5. Ethics and Eugenics. I want to end with some thoughts on ethics. The Cass review has shown zero evidence of harms of social transition or puberty blockers. The only harm is this hypothesis that they change the trajectory and outcome, locking children into a trans existence. This hypothesis is based on the worst quality evidence I've ever seen. This is why trans healthcare researchers are feeling stress and dismay at UK media and politicians cheering on Cass's evidence-based policy. It is a major exercise in gaslighting. But let's also unpack the main concern or risk proposed by Cass to justify restrictions on trans children. Why is growing up and still being trans seen as a problem? Here is where the Cass review reveals its biases. Being trans is seen as inherently a bad outcome. It doesn't matter if you're a happy trans teenager or a healthy trans adult. This is a worse outcome than being a cis adult. The Cass review uses HRT to justify this eugenicist bigotry. Trans people, the Cass review argues, are more likely than cis people to require ongoing HRT, lifelong medication. Therefore, the Cass review argues, policies that can limit and reduce the number of trans people are, medically speaking, morally justified. It just happens to be in the greater good to reduce the number of trans people. The Cass review does not say this explicitly, but it is implicitly there across the Cass review recommendations. Puberty blockers and social transition could increase the number of trans adults, and this alone is sufficient to justify restrictions. No matter the harm to trans people of denial of healthcare, of being forced through a puberty that is experienced as deeply harmful and traumatic, this harm is justified if the overall number of trans people is reduced. No matter the harms of denial of childhood social transition, of children growing up rejected and ashamed, this is justified if some children will thereby snap out of it and become cis. The Cass review does not look at the existing evidence of the harms of authoritarian and abusive restrictions on trans children. It does not look at the harms of requiring children to be assessed and problematized by gender service clinicians before showing them acceptance and love. It is not interested in this type of evidence. My own research has looked at the harms experienced by children of all ages in abusive, intrusive and coercive gender clinics. My own research has looked at the harms that parents noticed when they delayed their own child's social transition for months and years, often on the advice of gender clinicians. These parents talked about seeing rising levels of anxiety and depression in their children, of suicidal ideation and suicide attempts. They talked about a loss of childhood joy and children losing happiness, self-confidence and hope in the future. Research undertaken with trans adults on their childhood experiences shows the harms of childhood rejection and childhood conversion therapy, the risk of children growing up ashamed of who they are. The CAS review does not look at this evidence. Indeed, the CAS review is not interested in hearing from trans professionals, trans researchers, trans adults or trans children. We are not seen as trusted authorities on our own lives. We are not seen as reliable witnesses. In one particularly revealing paragraph, the CAS review makes clear that evidence drawn from listening to trans people will never be enough. The CAS review writes that even if a trans boy grows into a trans man who is happy and healthy, that cannot be considered a success. His own opinion on his life cannot be counted as evidence. The CAS review writes that because such a trans man never had the opportunity to live as a cis woman, he will never know what he has missed out on. The CAS review cannot find enough evidence of actual regret to argue that growing up trans is a bad outcome. So they move to the territory of imagining a parallel world where all trans people lived as cis. Cis lives are inherently more valuable. Cis lives are inherently better. The whole CAS review process is a manifestation of cis supremacy, of cis power over trans communities and trans children. Cis people hold all the power. They set the rules of the game. They dismiss existing evidence of benefits as low quality, whilst at the exact same time endorsing policy recommendations built on an absolute shambles of distortion, misrepresentation and nonsense. They do this in the knowledge that they will get away with it, because trans voices are disregarded and dismissed. Trans people, and particularly trans children, are deeply harmed by the cis supremacist NHS. We need to loudly call out the whole process as a sham, engineered to legitimise abusive and eugenicist measures that are already causing acute harm. We need to recognise that trans children have rights, including the right to a happy and supported childhood. Trans children have rights, including a right to affirmative healthcare without pathologisation. We need to stand with trans children and demand that their rights are respected. We have an uphill struggle ahead of us, but we need to stand together and demand better for all trans children. Trans rights, trans power, trans happiness matters.
It's difficult to disagree with their conclusion, really, about the bioessentialist / cis supremacist kind of viewpoint of the CAS review, where somebody being trans is an outcome to be avoided. We want to try and stop people from being trans at all, and we want them to stay cis, and we want them to present as cis, and we don't want them to have any of those nasty transy problems. So the idea that being trans is an outcome to be avoided is one of the many through lines through the CAS report, I think. And so that's been captured quite expertly by Dr. Horton.
They did such a good job on that one, and thank you for putting that together as well, actually, because that seemed like a good long bit of work there as well.
Yeah, definitely. If you're hearing this, by the time you hear this, there will be a transcript of that up on our website or, through social media somewhere. Give that a read if there's points that you'd like to refer back to or that you thought were particularly well phrased. That's our show. That's the end of the episode. Aside from saying all the usual stuff, do check out that full statement on our website. You can find us on Twitter, @WhatTheTrans, Facebook, obviously, What the Trans. We're on Threads, we're on Instagram.
This is a pop quiz of what you can remember, what we've got.
Of what our various social medias are. Yes, indeed. And if you feel like if you're feeling generous and feel like supporting what we do, particularly in the run-up to summer and going to this and that Pride all over the country and being able to buy tickets and get hotels, you can support us on Patreon. Thank you for listening, and we'll speak to you again in a couple of weeks.
Bye. This episode was written and produced by Ashleigh Talbot and Alex Bedwell, and edited by Amber. How do you how do you say?
Devereaux?
And edited by Amber Devereaux, and with the music composed by Robert Zara, Yui Carberg.
And we would especially like to thank our Patreon producers, who are Grabalicious,
Alex T,
Root-1,
Gray,
Elizabeth Anderson,
Bernice Roust,
Ellen Mellor,
Jay Hoskins,
Trowan,
Ashleigh,
Matty B,
Squid Xena,
Setcap,
Jane,
Roberto de Prunk,
Rose Absolute,
Sarah,
Cena,
Kiki T,
D,
Sky Kilane,
Eric Whitman,
B,
Jude,
Monsieur Squirrel,
Fergus Evans,
Anubis Jackal,
Kamina,
Brendan Craig,
Break the System,
Sean Phillips,
Heidi Reardon,
Ezra,
Sophia Lasix,
Lentil,
Philippa Teprog,
Clara Volume,
Amelia,
Corvina Ravenheart, the trans metal DJ from Twitch and VR chat, will play Saint Lucifer for props.
Tabitha Joe Cox, aka Candy,
Fiona McDonnell,
Torakuso H,
Murgatroyd,
Ontologically Unjust,
Stella,
Cinder Goza,
Rebecca Prentice,
Crazy Richard,
Dan Oblivion,
Florence Stanley,
The Cthulhu Kid,
Helen,
Ellie Hollingsworth bought too many magic cards,
Nick Ross,
Melody Nix,
Fiona Punchard,
John,
Nick Duffy,
C.B. Bailey,
Gordon Campbell,
Ted Delphus,
Wen Riverop,
Vic Parsons,
Patreon user,
Vic Kelly,
Catherine,
Sabrina McVeigh,
Cassius Adair,
Melissa Brooks,
Kraken 12,
April Heller,
Sophie Lewis,
Alexandra Lilly,
Claire Scott,
Ariadne Pena,
Lauren O'Nions,
Bernard's Pink Jelly Bean,
Lanus.
and Chris Hubley. Thank you!
Bye!